Hey everyone, welcome back to Tech360.tv. I'm Bobby Tonelli, and we are talking cameras once again. We're talking about the Sony A7III. Now, a while back, we did a review on the Sony A7R III. Well, since then, Sony released the A7III, which they said took bits and pieces from the A9, which we have here, and the A7R III, and they kind of put it into one camera. So what we're going to be doing today is not really talking about specs, because you can read those online. We're going to talk about real-world usage, and is the Sony A7 III a worthy contender to the A9? First and foremost, I do want to thank Sony Singapore for providing the cameras and the lenses, and Shootout Imaging for the Zeiss lenses for this review. Now let's talk about the cameras first. I'm going to talk about the A9, which is the big brother. This is the flagship of the Alpha series. Now the lens I have attached to it is the Zeiss Batiste 85.18. Beautiful lens, renders fantastically, it's sharp, very minimal chromatic aberration, and what's cool is it's pretty much stealth except for this LCD screen where you get all your information on your lens. So that is really wickedly cool. Let's talk about the body of the A9 first. Now, it looks very similar to the A7 III, as you can see, but there are some differences. It has a drive dial, which feels very, very solid, by the way. The grip is slightly shallower than the A7 III. It's not a big difference, but you will notice the difference in it. The EVF is higher resolution. The LCD is higher resolution. Now, when I mean higher resolution, there's a difference, but it's not night and day difference. It's just subtle, but it does make a difference when you're shooting. But overall, they look almost exactly the same. And I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing, considering that this is double the price of the A7 III. But let's talk about the performance of this camera, because this is where Sony has really just topped everybody in terms of speed of this. 24 megapixel mirrorless full frame camera. This uses an Exmos RS sensor. Now this is a backside illuminated sensor, similar to the A7 III. However, this sensor is built in with memory inside of it, and with that makes the sensor 10 times faster than the A7 III. 20 frames per second, zero blackout on the screen or in the EVF. It is crazy fast. It almost looks like the camera's just constantly autofocusing, but it's snapping photos. And the images are sharp. This is not like they're blurred images. No, it's capturing every single movement. And with the electronic shutter on this, there's no distortion. Now, this is something a lot of cameras, they have electronic shutters in them, but you do, if you're shooting people moving or babies or kids or wildlife, you could get this kind of weird warping look, or if you're in sort of odd lighting, you can get this kind of banding image lines on the images. There's none on this. It eliminates all that because it's so fast. And that's really where the A9 shines. In terms of image quality to the A7 III, if I put still to still, you're not going to notice really much of a difference. It's really the speed that makes this camera what it is. Having said that, the A7 III is no slouch either. Now, the lens I have attached to this is the Sony G Master 1635 f2.8. It's a really good overall lens. I'm not a wide angle shooter. If you are, you'll really like the 1635, but it is a very big lens and it adds a lot of weight to the camera. But Sony's G Master lenses are all pretty much big lenses, but the image quality is fantastic. Now, let's talk about the body of the A7 III. As I mentioned, it looks very similar to the A9. There are some differences. There's no drive dial on it, so that side is empty. The grip has a slightly more depth than the A9, so a little bit easier to hold in the hand. This is a lighter camera, 23 grams lighter. You're like, 23 grams is nothing, but you will notice a difference if you put it in your hands. Having said that though, it still feels great and very easy to shoot with. Now, performance-wise, the EVF has a slightly lower resolution than the A9 and the A7R III, as well as the LCD on the back of it. The mechanical shutter on this is faster than the A9. This does 10 frames per second. This does 5 frames per second mechanical shutter. Electronic shutter, different ballgame altogether. But this is faster. Let's talk about focus points, because this was something that was very interesting when they released the A7 III. The A7 III and the A9 have the same focus points for phase detection, 693 phase detection autofocus points. That's more than the A7R III, which is, I believe, 399. For contrast focus points, this has 425. The A9 has 25. You might go, why? I don't know. Maybe it could be the technology of the sensor, but what that means is when the phase detection isn't working, let's say in low light or with slower apertures, the A7 III will be better in low light situations. Besides that, the menu system on both is convoluted and very difficult to use. That's probably Sony's Achilles heel on these cameras. They need to fix that, and that could be a big firmware update, and hopefully they do that soon, because that's the one thing that makes using the Sony system very difficult. Besides that though, using the Sony A7 III, I did notice that the colors were a little bit warmer. I did notice that the images are slightly more detailed than the A9. Don't know if it's because of the sensor technology or if it's just because of software or firmware, but there is a slight difference. But unless you're a pixel peeper, to the average person, both are still very sharp and still very beautiful images. So there's no problem with that. So in conclusion, is the A7 III a worthy contender to the A9? And the answer is yes, it is. I'm gonna say for 80% of the photographers out there, the A7 III will be enough for you. If you need high resolution for billboards or magazines, A7R III is where you want to be. But for majority of photographers, the A7 III will be plenty, and I'm talking for a few years. But before I do go, I do want to highlight on the Zeiss Lens. Now, this is based off the planar design. It's an old design back in the day, but it's tried, tested, and proven. The images out of this lens is beautiful. It's got that kind of vintage look. It's not the sharpest lens. It's soft around the corners, a little bit of vignetting, but it's beautiful for portraitures or to kind of just get a little more of that filmatic look to it. And what's cool about this lens is that it's E-mount. It's a manual focus only lens, so you will have to manual focus on this Sony Alpha series, but it kicks in the zoom feature on the LCD or the EVF, so you'll be good to go on that with focus peaking. And another cool thing about this is if you want to use these for videography, which is fantastic to do, you actually have a key you can turn in here and you can actually release the clicking of the aperture, so it's a nice, smooth transition on the aperture. If you want to kind of get into that more cinematic look, check out these lenses. These are stunning. So then now the question is the A9 worth double the price of the A7 III? And Sony, I hate to say this, but I don't think it is. I mean, the A9 is beautiful, it's fantastic. I love shooting with it, as I do with the A7 III, but I could understand spending 30–40% more, but 100% more? I think you're gonna have to do some price adjustment on this. And only because you priced this camera so low, Sony, you were the ones that did it. People were spending the money for the A9. You decided to drop a $2,000 camera on everybody that blew the market out of the water, and I get it because you want to make an impact in the mirrorless market, but what you did, pushed your A9 into a category people might think twice about spending in. So Sony, love the technology, but adjust the price on this a little bit, as well as the A7R III. And I think all will be good in the Sony world. Anyway, those are my thoughts on the A7 III and the A9. Any questions or comments you have, leave them below. Follow us on Facebook, subscribe to us on YouTube. Until the next one, take care.